Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from, and what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between? I want to see how far this story can reach. Now lean closer. Here's where it all begins. In the unforgiving wilderness of Montana's Glacier Ridge, where ancient predators still roam free and human pride can cost lives, one man's greatest fear was about to become his most powerful teacher. What happens when a cowboy who can't face a house cat must protect an apex predator from men with rifles? What happens when 25 years of paralyzing terror collides with a moment that demands courage? This is the story of how 12 forgotten rules of wolfpack leadership transformed a broken man into something he never imagined he could be, and how sometimes the very thing that terrifies us most holds the key to our salvation. The autumn wind cut across the Montana high country like a razor, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. Thomas Blackwood pressed his back against the rough pine planks of his cabin wall, his weathered hands gripping the edges of the wooden water barrel that served as his only shield against the three men who had come to torment him. At 68, Tom's body bore the marks of 5 decades of ranch work, shoulders curved from years of lifting hay bales, hands gnarled from wrestling with stubborn cattle, and a face carved deep by sun and wind. But it was his eyes that told the real story of Thomas Blackwood, pale blue eyes that darted constantly, never settling, always searching for the next threat, the next reason to retreat. "Come on out, Tommy boy," called Jake Morrison, the youngest of the 3 ranch hands at barely 25, his voice dripping with the particular cruelty that youth often reserves for perceived weakness. "We just want to have a little chat about you selling this place and moving on." The 3 men sat their horses in a loose semicircle around Tom's cabin, their mounts shifting restlessly in the crisp air. But it wasn't the men that made Tom's heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. It was the dogs. 3 cattle dogs, bred for aggression and trained to intimidate, strained against their leather leashes. Blue heelers with the compact, muscular builds of animals designed for conflict, their eyes fixed on Tom with the predatory focus that had haunted his nightmares for 25 years. The largest, a mottled gray and black beast named Brutus, pulled so hard against his restraint that foam flecked the corners of his mouth. "See how eager they are?" laughed Carl Hutchins, a thick-set man in his 30s who took particular pleasure in other people's fear. "Been telling them about how you scream when you see a pup. They're curious to hear it for themselves." Tom's breathing came in short, shallow gasps. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the mountain cold, and his legs trembled with the familiar weakness that overtook him whenever he found himself face to face with anything that barked, growled, or showed its teeth. The phobia had ruled his life for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to move through the world without constantly scanning for 4-legged threats. "Please," Tom whispered, the word barely audible above the wind. Just take them away from here." His voice cracked on the words, and he hated himself for the weakness in it. 25 years ago, Thomas Blackwood had been a different man, a rancher who could face down angry bulls and territorial stallions without flinching. But that man had died in a hospital waiting room, crushed under the weight of choices that could never be undone. "What's that, old-timer?" The third rider, Bobby Torres, cupped his ear in mock confusion. "Speak up! Can't hear you over the sound of your knees knocking together." The dogs sensed Tom's fear like sharks smelling blood in the water. They pulled harder against their leashes, their barks echoing off the pine-covered mountainsides. The sound seemed to punch through Tom's chest, triggering muscle memory of fangs and tearing flesh, of screaming that never seemed to be enough. This had become a monthly ritual over the past year. The 3 ranch hands would ride up from the valley, bringing their dogs and their cruel entertainment, pushing Tom closer and closer to the breaking point. They worked for Marcus Webb, a land developer who wanted Tom's 160 acres for a luxury resort, and they had made it clear that they would keep coming until he sold. You know what I think? Jake swung down from his saddle with fluid grace, landing in the dust with his boots making sharp reports against the hard-packed earth. I think you're not just afraid of dogs. I think you're afraid of everything. I think you're afraid of life itself. Tom closed his eyes, trying to summon the meditation techniques he had read about in the self-help books that cluttered his cabin. Breathe deep. Find your center. But center was hard to locate when 3 aggressive dogs were straining to reach him, their claws scraping against stone as they fought their handlers for just a few more inches of leash. The lead dog, Brutus, suddenly reared up on his hind legs, his front paws clawing at the air as he released a bark that seemed to shake the very mountains. The sound hit Tom like a physical blow, sending him stumbling sideways along the cabin wall, his hands scrambling for purchase on anything that might keep him upright. "Look at him dance!" Bobby whooped, spurring his horse closer. "Like a scarecrow in a hurricane!" Tom's vision began to tunnel, the edges going gray as panic clawed its way up his throat. This was how it always ended, with him retreating into the cabin, barricading the door, and listening to their laughter fade as they rode away, satisfied with another successful humiliation. But today felt different. Today, there was something in the air beyond the scent of autumn and approaching winter, something wild and primal that made the horses shift nervously and the dogs pause in their barking to sniff the wind. "Settle down, Brutus." Carl yanked hard on the leash, but the big healer's attention had shifted away from Tom. The dog's ears pricked forward, his body going rigid with the alertness of a predator sensing something larger than himself. That's when they all heard it, a sound that turned the blood in their veins to ice water. A wolf's howl, low and mournful, drifted down from the ridge above Tom's cabin. But this wasn't the distant call of a wild pack hunting in the high country. This was close. This was immediate. This was the sound of something powerful and desperate approaching their little tableau of human cruelty. The 3 dogs fell silent immediately, their ears flattening against their skulls as instinct overrode training. Even Brutus, the most aggressive of the pack, began backing away from the direction of the sound, his tail tucking between his legs. "What the hell was that?" Jake's voice had lost its mocking edge, replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like fear. Through the timber above the cabin, a shadow moved between the pine trunks. At first, it was just a flicker of motion, dark against dark, but as it drew closer, the shape resolved into something that made all 5 men, predator and prey alike, freeze in recognition of apex authority. A wolf emerged from the tree line, and even at a distance of 50 yards, its presence commanded absolute attention. This was no ordinary wolf. This was a creature that had reached the pinnacle of its species' evolutionary ladder. Standing nearly 3 feet at the shoulder, with a coat that shifted from silver to charcoal to pure black depending on how the light struck it, the animal moved with the fluid grace of something that had never known a moment's doubt about its place in the natural order. But something was wrong. The wolf's gait was uneven, favoring its left rear leg, and dark stains matted the fur along its ribs. As it drew closer, Tom could see the unmistakable evidence of gunshot wounds, at least 2, possibly 3, that had torn through muscle and sinew, but somehow failed to bring down this magnificent predator. The animal paused at the edge of the clearing, its amber eyes taking in the scene with the calculating intelligence of a battlefield commander assessing threats and opportunities. For a moment that stretched like hours, the wolf's gaze swept over the 3 mounted men, dismissed them as irrelevant, and finally settled on Tom. In that instant of connection, Tom felt something shift in his chest. The panic that had gripped him moments before began to transform into something else, not courage exactly, but a recognition of shared pain. This creature was hurt, alone, and facing overwhelming odds, just like him. The wolf took another step forward, stumbled slightly as its injured leg gave way, and then collapsed onto its side near Tom's porch steps. Blood pooled in the dust beneath its body, and its breathing came in labored gasps that spoke of internal injuries beyond the visible wounds. "Jesus Christ," Bobby whispered. "That thing's huge." The three ranch hands reached for their rifles with the synchronized movement of men who had grown up believing that the only good predator was a dead predator. Metal clicked against leather as they drew their weapons from saddle scabbards, the sound sharp and final in the mountain air. "This is perfect," Jake said, his voice tight with excitement. "We'll put that thing out of its misery and do the whole county a favor. Probably been killing livestock for months." Tom watched the rifles rise, watched the men take aim at the wounded creature that lay gasping in the dust of his front yard. And in that moment, something that had been dormant for 25 years stirred to life in the deepest part of his soul. "No," he said. The word came out stronger than he had intended, cutting through the mountain air with surprising authority. The three men paused, their weapons still raised, but their attention suddenly focused on the man who had spent months cowering from their dogs. "What did you say?" Jake's finger hovered over his trigger, but his eyes were fixed on Tom with genuine surprise. "I said no." Tom pushed himself away from the cabin wall, his legs still shaking but somehow supporting his weight. "Put the guns down." For 25 years, Thomas Blackwood had defined himself by what he couldn't do, by what he was afraid of, by what he ran from. But as he looked at the wounded wolf struggling to breathe in his front yard, he realized that some things mattered more than fear. The wolf's amber eyes found his again, and Tom saw something in their depths that shook him to his core. Not pleading. Wolves didn't beg. Not submission. This creature had never bent its neck to anything. What Tom saw was acceptance. The wolf had made its choice to come here, to seek sanctuary in the territory of the two-legged creatures who had wounded it. Now it would accept whatever fate that choice brought. But Tom realized he had a choice too. "You protecting that killer, old man?" Carl's voice carried a note of disbelief that suggested he couldn't quite process what he was witnessing. "You scared of dogs, but you'll stand up for a wolf?" Tom took his first step away from the cabin wall, then another. His legs felt like water, and his heart hammered so hard he was sure the men could hear it, but he kept moving. 25 years of retreat had to end somewhere, and apparently it was ending here, in the dust of his front yard, with a wounded predator as his unlikely catalyst. "That animal is bleeding to death," Tom said, his voice growing steadier with each word. "It's not a threat to anyone." "The hell it's not," Jake snapped. "Wolves kill everything they can get their teeth into. Livestock, pets, children if they get the chance." But even as Jake spoke, Tom could see doubt creeping into the younger man's eyes. The three cattle dogs, bred for aggression and trained to fear nothing, continued to cower behind their handlers' horses. Whatever instinctive recognition had made them fall silent was still operating, still warning them that they were in the presence of something beyond their understanding. Tom continued his approach to the wolf, each step a victory over 25 years of paralysis. The animal's breathing was shallow now, its eyes beginning to glaze with the approach of unconsciousness. Blood continued to seep from its wounds, staining the earth beneath its magnificent body. "Easy, boy," Tom whispered, the same words that would echo in his memory for years to come. "I know what it's like to be hunted." The wolf's ear twitched at the sound of his voice, and for just a moment its amber gaze sharpened with something that might have been understanding. Here were two wounded souls, recognizing each other across the vast gulf that supposedly separated their species. "Get away from that thing!" Jake raised his rifle again, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "It could take your throat out with its last breath." Tom knelt in the dust beside the wolf, close enough now to see the rise and fall of its rib cage, to smell the wild scent of pine and snow that clung to its coat. At this distance, the animal's size was even more impressive. Easily 140 pounds of muscle and sinew, with paws the size of Tom's hands and teeth that could crush bone. But what struck Tom most was the intelligence in the wolf's eyes. This wasn't the blank stare of a mindless predator. This was a thinking creature, a being capable of complex emotions and social bonds. As Tom looked into those amber depths, he saw grief, exhaustion, and a resignation that reminded him painfully of his own reflection in the mirror each morning. "I'm going to help you," Tom whispered, his words meant for the wolf alone. "Don't know how yet, but I'm going to try." The wolf's head moved slightly, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to bring its muzzle closer to Tom's outstretched hand. The gesture was so subtle that the mounted men probably missed it, but Tom felt the significance like a thunderbolt. This apex predator, this king of the wilderness, was choosing to trust him. "Tom, you've lost your damn mind," Bobby called from his horse. "That thing will tear you apart the second it gets its strength back." But Tom was remembering something his wife Sarah had told him, back in the days when she was studying wildlife biology, and he was just a young rancher who thought he knew everything about animals. She had said that wolves were more like humans than most people realized, that they lived in complex social structures, grieved their dead, and sometimes adopted outsiders into their packs when the need was great enough. At the time, he had dismissed her words as academic nonsense. Wolves were predators, cattle were prey, and a rancher's job was to protect his herd from anything with teeth and claws. But now, kneeling in the dust beside this wounded giant, Tom began to understand what Sarah had been trying to tell him. "Get back on your horses," Tom said, without turning to look at the three men. "Leave this animal alone." "Or what?" Jake's voice cracked with nervous laughter. "You'll sick your attack wolf on us?" But Tom noticed that none of the three men were spurring their horses closer. Something had changed in the dynamic of the confrontation, some shift in the balance of power that even they could sense. The most telling evidence of that shift came from the cattle dogs themselves. Brutus, the massive healer who had been straining to reach Tom just minutes before, now pressed himself against his handler's horse with his ears flat against his skull. The other two dogs mirrored his behavior, their aggressive postures replaced by the unmistakable signs of submission. Tom had read enough about animal behavior to recognize what he was seeing. Despite their breeding and training, despite their numerical advantage and the support of their human handlers, these domestic dogs were responding to something primal in the wolf's presence. Even wounded and bleeding, the wild predator commanded a respect that transcended species lines. "You see that?" Tom gestured toward the cowering dogs without taking his eyes off the wolf. "Your attack dogs won't even look at him. Maybe you should ask yourself why." Jake's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. The humiliation of having his prize animals cower in the presence of the enemy was more than his young pride could bear. But when he raised his rifle again, his hands were shaking with something that looked suspiciously like fear. "I don't care if that thing is the ghost of Old Yellow," Jake snarled. "It's a wolf, and wolves kill cattle. End of story." The wolf's breathing grew more labored, and Tom could see that time was running out. Whatever internal injuries the animal had sustained were taking their toll. In a few more minutes, the choice between helping and hurting would be academic. The great predator would be beyond anyone's reach. But as Tom watched the life ebbing from the wolf's amber eyes, he made a decision that would change everything that followed. He stood up, placing himself directly between the wounded animal and the three rifles. And for the first time in 25 years, Thomas Blackwood faced down his tormentors without flinching. "You want to shoot that wolf," he said, his voice steady and calm. "You'll have to shoot through me first." The words hung in the mountain air like smoke from a gunshot, and for a moment, nobody moved. Jake's rifle remained pointed toward the wolf, but now Tom's body blocked a clear shot. The young ranch hand's face cycled through a dozen different emotions: surprise, anger, confusion, and something that might have been grudging respect. "You've lost your mind, old man," Carl said, but his voice lacked the casual cruelty that had characterized his earlier taunts. "That thing's a killer." "Maybe," Tom replied, not moving from his position between the guns and the wolf. "But it's also a living creature that's suffering. And I've had enough of watching suffering get ignored while folks worry about their convenience." Behind him, Tom could hear the wolf's breathing grow more shallow. The animal was fading fast, and standing here arguing with 3 armed men wasn't going to change that. But something had crystallized in Tom's mind during the past few minutes, a clarity of purpose that he hadn't felt since the night his family died. For 25 years, he had chosen safety over action, retreat over engagement, fear over compassion. Every time a situation demanded that he stand up and be counted, he had found a reason to step back, to let someone else take the risk. But this wounded wolf couldn't wait for someone else. This moment demanded that Thomas Blackwood finally decide who he was going to be. "I'm asking you one more time," Tom said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that surprised even him. "Get on your horses and leave my property." Jake's finger tightened on his trigger, and for a heartbeat, Tom thought the young man might actually pull it. The idea of shooting through a human being to kill an animal was probably beyond even Jake's capacity for cruelty, but pride and peer pressure could drive people to unthinkable extremes. Then Bobby spoke up from his position at the edge of the clearing. "Jake, let's get out of here. This isn't worth the trouble." "Like hell," Jake snapped. "I'm not backing down from some crazy old hermit who's gone soft for a wolf." But Tom could see the uncertainty in the younger man's eyes. Whatever Jake had expected when he rode up here today, it wasn't this. He had come to intimidate a frightened old man, not to face down someone who seemed willing to die for his principles. The standoff stretched on, seconds feeling like hours, as 3 rifles remained trained in Tom's general direction, and he stood firm between them and the dying wolf. The mountain wind picked up, rustling through the pine needles overhead and carrying with it the scent of approaching weather. That's when they heard it again. Another wolf howl, this one closer and more urgent than the first. Then another from a different direction. Within moments, the mountainside echoed with the voices of what sounded like a dozen wolves, all calling to their fallen leader with the primal grief of a family mourning their loss. The effect on the 3 cattle dogs was immediate and dramatic. Brutus actually whimpered, pressing himself so tightly against his handler's horse that the animal sidestepped nervously. The other 2 dogs began to tremble, their aggression completely overwhelmed by instinctive recognition of their place in the natural hierarchy. "Jesus," Bobby whispered. "The whole pack's out there." Jake's rifle wavered slightly as he tried to peer into the timber beyond Tom's cabin. The howling continued, seeming to come from every direction at once, creating an auditory net that suggested the 3 men were surrounded by apex predators. But Tom felt no fear as the wolf voices rose and fell around them. Instead, he experienced something he hadn't felt in decades, a sense of belonging to something larger than his own small, frightened existence. These wolves were grieving their leader, calling to him across the void that separated life from death. It was a display of loyalty and love that put most human relationships to shame. The wounded wolf at Tom's feet stirred slightly at the sound of his pack's voices. His amber eyes flickered open, and for just a moment, his head lifted from the ground as if he were trying to answer their calls. But the effort was too much for his damaged body, and he collapsed back into the dust with a sound that was part sigh, part moan. "That settles it," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. "We kill this one before the others come looking for him." "No," Tom said, and this time the word carried the weight of absolute conviction. "This ends here. Something had changed in Thomas Blackwood's voice, some fundamental shift that even the three armed men could sense. The trembling that had characterized his earlier words was gone, replaced by a steadiness that seemed to draw its strength from sources deeper than mere human courage. "You know what I think?" Tom said, still not moving from his protective position over the wolf. "I think you boys are scared. I think you came up here expecting to push around a frightened old man, and instead you found something that reminds you how small you really are." Jake's face flushed red, but Tom continued before the young man could respond. "Look at your dogs," Tom gestured toward the three cowering animals. "They know what you're too proud to admit. That wolf isn't just some random predator. He's a leader, a king, and even dying, he commands more respect than any of us have ever earned." The pack's howling intensified, and now they could see movement in the timber, dark shapes flowing between the trees like shadows given substance. The wolves weren't approaching yet, but their presence was palpable, a reminder that the natural world operated by laws more ancient and fundamental than human property lines. Carl was the first to crack. "Jake, this is getting out of hand. Let's just go." "We're not going anywhere," Jake snarled, but his voice carried the brittle edge of fear, masked as bravado. "That wolf dies today, and the old man can watch or join it." But even as Jake spoke, Tom could see doubt creeping into his companions' faces. Bobby kept glancing nervously toward the tree line, and Carl had quietly loosened his rifle in its scabbard, preparing for a quick retreat. The wounded wolf stirred again, and this time, when his eyes opened, they fixed on Tom with an intensity that was almost human. In those amber depths, Tom saw something that shook him to his core, not just pain or exhaustion, but a kind of desperate hope. The animal was looking at him as if he might actually be the salvation it had sought when it dragged itself to this remote cabin. "You're not going to die here," Tom whispered to the wolf. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Jake Morrison had reached the limit of his patience and his pride. The howling from the surrounding forest, the fearful behavior of his prized cattle dogs, and most of all, the unexpected defiance of the man he had come to intimidate, all of it combined to push him past the point of rational thought. "That's it." Jake raised his rifle to his shoulder, taking careful aim over Tom's head toward the wolf. "I'm ending this right now." But as his finger began to tighten on the trigger, something extraordinary happened. The wounded wolf, despite his grievous injuries and approaching death, somehow found the strength to lift his massive head. His amber eyes locked onto Jake's with a gaze so intense, so filled with ancient authority, that the young man's hands began to shake. For just a moment, the roles reversed completely. Jake, sitting high on his horse with a loaded rifle in his hands, became the prey. The dying wolf, collapsed in the dust with blood pooling beneath his body, became the predator. It was a transformation that defied logic, but operated on levels of understanding deeper than rational thought. The wolf's lips pulled back slightly, not in aggression, but in what could only be described as a smile, the knowing expression of a creature who had faced death many times, and found it less frightening than the fear that drove his enemies. Jake's rifle began to waver, the barrel describing small circles as his arms trembled with the effort of maintaining his aim. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the mountain cold, and his breathing came in short, sharp gasps. "Shoot it!" Carl shouted, but his own voice cracked with strain. "What are you waiting for?" But Jake couldn't pull the trigger. Something in the wolf's gaze had reached into the deepest part of his being and found the scared boy who still lived beneath all the bluster and cruelty. For the first time in his life, Jake Morrison was facing something that couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bullied, couldn't be made to back down no matter how much noise he made. The wolf held his gaze for another heartbeat, then slowly, deliberately, closed his eyes and let his head sink back to the ground. The message was clear. "I am not afraid of you. Do what you will." Tom felt the shift in the air like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. The balance of power that had been teetering back and forth since the wolf's arrival had finally settled, and he could sense that whatever happened in the next few moments would determine not just the animal's fate, but his own transformation. "Jake," Tom said quietly, "put the gun down." The young ranch hand's rifle continued to shake in his hands, but he didn't lower it. Behind him, Bobby and Carl exchanged nervous glances, clearly ready to bolt at the first sign that the situation was spiraling beyond their control. "You don't understand," Jake's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "If I don't kill it, if I back down now—" "If you back down now," Tom interrupted, "you might discover what it feels like to be a man instead of a bully." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Jake's face went white, then red, then white again as the truth of Tom's observation sank in. For 25 years, Thomas Blackwood had been running from confrontation, and in all that time he had gained a deep understanding of what fear looked like from the inside. The pack's howling reached a crescendo, and now the wolves were close enough that they could see eyes gleaming in the shadows between the trees. But the predators made no move to attack, no aggressive advance toward the humans who threatened their leader. They simply waited, their presence a reminder that some bonds transcend death itself. Tom knelt beside the wounded wolf again, placing his hand gently on the animal's massive head. The fur was coarse beneath his fingers, warm with life that was slowly ebbing away. As he touched the great predator, Tom felt something pass between them. Not communication exactly, but a recognition of shared understanding. "I've been afraid my whole life," Tom said, speaking to Jake, but never taking his eyes off the wolf. "Afraid of dogs, afraid of conflict, afraid of making the wrong choice. But you know what I learned today?" Jake's rifle finally began to lower, though his hands still shook with unresolved tension. "I learned that being afraid isn't the same as being weak, and being brave isn't the same as being right." The wolf's breathing grew even more shallow, each breath a visible struggle against the damage that bullets had inflicted on his magnificent body. Tom could feel the life force ebbing beneath his hand, could sense that they were down to minutes, perhaps less. "That animal needs help," Tom said, finally looking up at the three mounted men. "Medical attention, a veterinarian. Something more than standing here arguing about who has the right to kill what." "Nearest vet is 40 miles down the mountain," Bobby said quietly. "Even if we wanted to help, which we don't, that thing would be dead before we got halfway there." Tom felt a stab of despair, but then he remembered something Sarah had taught him during her wildlife biology studies. Wolves were incredibly tough, capable of surviving injuries that would kill most other animals. If he could stop the bleeding, if he could get fluids into the animal, there might be a chance. "Then I'll do what I can here," Tom said. "But first, you three need to leave." Jake's rifle was pointing at the ground now, but his face still burned with the humiliation of backing down. "This isn't over, old man. Wolf or no wolf, you still need to sell this place and move on." "Maybe," Tom replied, "but that's a conversation for another day." The pack's howling began to fade as the wolves retreated deeper into the timber, but their presence could still be felt like electricity in the air. They were waiting, watching, ready to respond to whatever fate befell their leader. Carl was the first to turn his horse away from the cabin. "Come on, Jake. Let's get out of here before those things decide to come closer." Bobby followed suit, clearly relieved to be leaving the scene of what had become an uncomfortable confrontation. But Jake remained for a moment longer, staring down at Tom and the dying wolf with an expression that mixed anger, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Why?" Jake asked finally. "Why risk everything for an animal that would kill you without thinking twice?" Tom considered the question seriously before answering. "Because maybe that's what separates us from the animals. the ability to choose mercy even when it's not convenient. After the three ranch hands disappeared down the mountain trail, Tom found himself alone with the wounded wolf, and a silence so profound it seemed to press against his eardrums. The pack had withdrawn into the deep timber, but he could still sense their presence. A dozen pairs of eyes watching from the shadows, waiting to see if their leader would live or die. Tom's cabin was sparse, but he had basic medical supplies from his years of tending to himself in isolation: bandages, antiseptic, pain medication left over from his own injuries and illnesses. As he gathered what he needed, he tried to remember everything Sarah had taught him about wound care and emergency veterinary medicine. The wolf lay completely still as Tom approached with his makeshift medical kit, but those amber eyes tracked his every movement. There was intelligence there, and something that looked remarkably like trust. This apex predator, this king of the wilderness, was allowing a human to tend to wounds inflicted by humans. "Easy, boy," Tom whispered as he began to examine the gunshot wounds. "I'm going to try to help, but it's going to hurt." The wolf's injuries were worse than Tom had initially thought. 2 bullets had passed through the animal's flank, missing vital organs but causing massive tissue damage and blood loss. A third had grazed his hind leg, contributing to the limp but not posing an immediate threat to his life. As Tom began cleaning the wounds, the wolf remained perfectly still, not even flinching when the antiseptic made contact with torn flesh. It was a display of stoicism that humbled the old rancher. He had seen grown men scream over paper cuts, but this wild creature endured agony without so much as a whimper. "You're tougher than I am," Tom murmured as he worked. "Always have been, I suppose." The process took nearly 2 hours, but gradually Tom managed to clean and bandage the wolf's wounds. The animal had lost a tremendous amount of blood, and Tom knew that infection was still a serious risk, but at least the immediate bleeding had stopped. As the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across Tom's clearing, the wolves returned. They emerged from the timber one by one. Magnificent creatures that moved with the fluid grace of apex predators. 12 wolves in total, ranging from juveniles to full-grown adults, all focused on their wounded leader and the human who knelt beside him. Tom felt his old fear trying to reassert itself as the pack drew closer. 12 wolves could tear him apart in seconds if they chose to view him as a threat. But something in their approach suggested that judgment had already been passed, and somehow, impossibly, he had been found acceptable. The pack arranged itself in a loose circle around the injured alpha, close enough to show support but far enough away to avoid crowding. Tom found himself at the center of this wild parliament, the only human who had ever been granted such access to wolf society. The alpha female, a sleek gray creature only slightly smaller than the wounded male, approached to within 10 feet of Tom before settling onto her haunches. Her gaze was direct but not aggressive, and Tom had the distinct impression that he was being evaluated by intelligence every bit as keen as his own. For long minutes, nothing happened. The wolves simply watched, their presence both comforting and intimidating. Then the wounded alpha stirred slightly, lifting his massive head to look at his pack. A low rumble emerged from his throat, not a growl, but something that sounded almost like speech. The response was immediate. Every wolf in the circle lifted their muzzles toward the darkening sky and released a harmonized howl that seemed to shake the very mountains. It was a sound of grief and loss, but also of acceptance and continuation. The pack was acknowledging their leader's condition while affirming their unity. When the howling ended, something had changed. Tom could feel it in the air, could see it in the way the wolves looked at him. He had passed some kind of test, had been granted a form of acceptance that no human had ever achieved. The alpha female rose and approached Tom directly, close enough that he could smell the wild scent of her coat, could see the intelligence burning in her yellow eyes. For a moment, She simply studied him. Then she did something that would haunt his dreams for years to come. She touched her nose to his outstretched hand. As full darkness settled over the Montana wilderness, Tom found himself in the extraordinary position of serving as a human nurse to a wounded wolf, while a dozen of the animal's family members maintained vigil in his front yard. The situation was so surreal that he had to keep reminding himself it was actually happening. The wounded alpha's condition had stabilized somewhat. His breathing was less labored, and the bleeding had stopped completely. Tom had managed to get some water into the animal using a turkey baster, and the wolf had even eaten a small piece of raw beef from Tom's emergency food supply. But it was the behavior of the pack that truly amazed him. Rather than returning to their territory in the high country, the wolves had settled in for the night around Tom's cabin. They formed a protective perimeter, with sentries posted at strategic points while others rested near their fallen leader. Tom had read about this behavior in Sarah's wildlife books, but seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. These weren't mindless predators acting on instinct. They were a family caring for their patriarch, making complex decisions about risk and loyalty that would challenge most human organizations. As the night wore on, Tom found himself drawn into the pack's rhythm. When they were alert, he was alert. When they rested, he allowed himself to relax. It was as if he had been temporarily adopted into their social structure, granted a role he could never have imagined. Around midnight, the wounded alpha stirred and managed to lift his head long enough to drink from the bowl of water Tom had placed beside him. The effort exhausted the great wolf, but Tom could see that his eyes were clearer, more focused than they had been earlier. "That's it, boy," Tom whispered. "Keep fighting." The alpha female approached at the sound of Tom's voice, and for a moment, human and wolf regarded each other in the moonlight. There was something almost ceremonial about the encounter, as if ancient treaties were being negotiated between species that had been enemies for millennia. Then the female wolf did something that stopped Tom's heart. She lay down beside her injured mate, close enough to share body heat, and rested her muzzle on Tom's knee. The gesture was unmistakable. She was placing her trust, and her pack's trust, in this strange human who had chosen to help rather than harm. Tom woke at first light to find himself surrounded by sleeping wolves. Sometime during the night, he had dozed off sitting against his cabin wall, and the pack had arranged itself around him like a living security blanket. The wounded alpha lay on his other side, still weak but noticeably more alert than he had been the previous evening. As consciousness returned fully, Tom realized that something fundamental had changed in his relationship with the natural world. For 25 years, he had lived in fear of anything with teeth and claws, convinced that predators existed only to cause pain and destruction. But this night among the wolves had shown him a different truth. These animals weren't monsters. They were a family, bound together by loyalty and love that put most human relationships to shame. They grieved their losses, celebrated their victories, and cared for their wounded with a devotion that transcended species boundaries. The alpha female stirred as Tom moved, her yellow eyes opening to study his face in the growing light. For a moment, neither human nor wolf moved. Then she rose gracefully to her feet and padded to the edge of the clearing. One by one, the other pack members followed, until only the wounded alpha remained beside Tom. But they didn't leave. Instead, the pack arranged itself in the timber at the edge of Tom's property, close enough to maintain contact with their leader but far enough away to avoid alarming any humans who might approach during the day. Tom understood instinctively that this was a temporary arrangement. The wolves were waiting for their alpha to recover enough to travel, and then they would return to their territory in the high country. But for now, for however long it took, they were maintaining their vigil. The wounded wolf struggled to his feet as the sun climbed higher, his movements stiff and painful, but showing remarkable improvement from the previous day. Tom helped support him as he limped to the water bowl, noting with satisfaction that the animal's appetite had returned along with his strength. "You're going to make it," Tom said softly. "You're going to be just fine." 3 days passed in this strange interspecies communion before the outside world intruded again. Tom had fallen into a routine of caring for the wolf, who he had begun calling King, in recognition of the animal's obvious status within the pack. The great wolf's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. The wounds were healing cleanly, his strength was returning, and he was even beginning to show interest in rejoining his family. Tom was changing King's bandages when he heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the timber he could see 3 riders heading up the mountain trail, Jake, Bobby, and Carl, returning for another round of intimidation. But this time, they weren't alone. A 4th rider accompanied them, an older man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. As they drew closer, Tom recognized Marcus Webb, the land developer who wanted to buy his property. King stirred at the sound of voices, his ears pricking forward with alertness. In the timber beyond the clearing, Tom could sense the pack's immediate response to the approaching threat. They didn't show themselves, but their presence was palpable, a reminder that this isolated cabin was no longer undefended. "Thomas Blackwood," Webb called as the 4 men rode into the clearing. "We need to talk." Webb was a man in his 50s, expensively dressed even for a ride into the wilderness. His horse was a purebred Arabian that probably cost more than Tom's entire annual income, and everything about his bearing suggested someone who was accustomed to getting his way. "Nothing to talk about," Tom replied, not moving from his position beside King. "I told your boys before, I'm not selling." Webb's eyes widened as he took in the scene before him. Tom kneeling beside a massive wolf, bandages and medical supplies scattered around them, and the unmistakable evidence that the old rancher had been caring for a wild predator. "Jesus Christ," Webb muttered. "The boys told me you'd lost your mind, but I didn't believe them." King struggled to his feet, his recovery dramatic enough that he could now stand without assistance. The wolf was still weak, still healing, but his presence commanded immediate attention from the 4 mounted men. Even Webb's expensive horse sidestepped nervously at the sight of the apex predator. "That's a wolf," Webb said unnecessarily. "Yes, it is," Tom replied, "and he's under my protection." The standoff that followed was different from the one 3 days earlier. Tom felt no fear as he faced the 4 mounted men, no trembling in his hands or weakness in his legs. Caring for King had completed a transformation that had been building in him for 25 years. He had finally remembered who he was meant to be. "Mr. Webb," Tom said, his voice carrying quiet authority, "you and your boys need to leave my property. Now." Webb's face flushed with anger and disbelief. He had come here expecting to deal with a frightened hermit, not a man who stood calmly beside a wild predator and spoke with the confidence of someone who had found his center. "You can't be serious," Webb sputtered. "You're protecting a killer. That thing probably has rabies." But even as Webb spoke, King was demonstrating exactly how wrong such assumptions could be. The great wolf moved to Tom's side with the fluid grace of perfect health, his amber eyes fixed on the mounted men with intelligent assessment rather than mindless aggression. At that moment, the pack emerged from the timber. 12 wolves flowed out of the forest like shadows given substance, taking positions around the clearing with the precision of a military unit. They made no aggressive moves, issued no challenges, but their message was unmistakable. The alpha was protected, and any threat to him would be met with overwhelming force. Jake Morrison's face went white as he found himself surrounded by apex predators, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. The 3 cattle dogs that had terrorized Tom just days before now whimpered and pressed themselves against their handlers' horses, every instinct screaming that they were in the presence of their natural superiors. "This is impossible," Webb whispered. "Wolves don't behave like this." "They do," Tom said quietly, when they're led by someone worth following. As he spoke, Tom realized that he wasn't just talking about King. For 25 years, he had believed that leadership meant domination, that strength required the ability to intimidate and control. But watching the pack operate had taught him something different. True leadership was about service, about putting the needs of others before your own comfort, about standing up to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, even when it meant facing your deepest fears. King stepped forward, his massive frame radiating health and authority despite the healing wounds beneath his bandages. The wolf looked directly at Webb, and in that amber gaze, the developer saw something that made him reach instinctively for his rifle. But before Webb could draw his weapon, King did something extraordinary. The great wolf sat down beside Tom, then slowly, deliberately, lay down in the dust with his head resting on his paws. It was a gesture of complete trust, a demonstration that he felt no threat from these intruders because he knew Tom would protect him. The message was clear. This human had earned the loyalty of the apex predator. What did that say about who was really in charge here? Webb's hand fell away from his rifle as the full implications of what he was seeing sank in. Around the clearing, the pack maintained their positions, not aggressive, but ready. They were waiting for their alpha's signal, and their alpha was clearly content to let Tom handle the situation. "Get off my land," Tom said, and for the first time in 25 years, he spoke with the absolute authority of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. Webb looked around the clearing one more time, at the wolves, at Tom, at his own men who were clearly ready to retreat. Then, without another word, he wheeled his expensive horse around and rode back down the mountain trail, his 3 hired guns following close behind. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Tom knelt beside King and placed his hand on the wolf's massive head. The great predator looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom older than civilization, and Tom finally understood what Sarah had been trying to teach him all those years ago. Leadership wasn't about being the strongest, or the loudest, or the most aggressive. It was about being the one others could count on when everything fell apart. It was about standing up for what was right, even when, especially when, it scared you to death. The pack began to disperse back into the timber, their vigil no longer necessary. King rose to his feet, his strength fully returned, and Tom knew that the time for parting had come. The wolf had a family to return to, a territory to reclaim, a life to live in the wild places where he belonged. But as King padded toward the tree line, he paused and looked back at Tom one final time. In that amber gaze, Tom saw gratitude, respect, and something that looked remarkably like friendship. Then the great wolf disappeared into the forest, taking with him the last of Tom's fear and leaving behind the quiet confidence of a man who had finally learned to lead. Tom stood alone in his clearing as the sun set behind the mountain peaks, but he no longer felt isolated or afraid. Somewhere in the timber above his cabin, a wolf pack was reuniting with their leader, and somewhere in his own heart, Thomas Blackwood had found his way home. The 12 forgotten rules of wolf pack leadership had taught him the most important lesson of all. True strength comes not from dominating others, but from serving something greater than yourself. And sometimes, the very thing you fear most turns out to be the thing that sets you free. Will Tom's transformation last when greater challenges arise? How will his newfound confidence change his relationship with the community that has scorned him? And what other lessons might the wilderness teach a man brave enough to listen? The answers await in the next chapter of this incredible journey, where an old cowboy's education in leadership has only just begun, and where the bonds forged between man and wolf will be tested by forces neither could face alone.